Welcome to a new session of videos about modern Indian history. This is RK and I'm going to give you a brief overview about the Viceroys of India. After the 1857 revolt, the East India Company government in India ended and the subsequent authority of India fell into the hands of the Crown. The British Crown wanted to avoid any of the mistakes that they have done during the Governor Generalships of East India Company, and so created a series of systems in order to ensure stable and continued authority of British in India. Among the different systems which the British introduced in India was the Viceroy of India. My name is Ranganathan S.V.N. Kondala, and this series of videos will be quite useful for your prelims and your mains. Keep watching, like, follow and subscribe for the entire series. Now let us begin. The year is 1857. India just came out of an sepoy mutiny. It was a huge Indian First War of Independence, a revolutionary attempt against the East India Company. Although the revolution was successfully suppressed by the British Crown, Lord Canning, the man in charge, the last Governor General of India, as well as the next subsequent representative of the Crown in India, had a major job. In 1858, Government of India Act was passed and establishing the office of Viceroy, which was to be held exactly by the same person who held the position of Governor General of India. Now, the difference between these two was the Governor General of India was to be the administrative head of India, while the Viceroy of India was to be the representative head. Very, very similar to how we have the office of President, who is the representative head, while the office of Prime Minister, who is the de facto head of India. The West Ministerial model. Lord Canning issued a royal proclamation in the Darbar of Allahabad 1858, which was one of the first biggest major darbars being conducted, a darbar or a meeting hall being conducted by the British Crown, informing the people of India that Queen Victoria has now acquired direct control of India. The proclamation also outlined clearly the principles by which India was to be governed by the British Crown and also the British policy towards the people living in India. And one important change which we observe here is from here on, all people of India are represented as the British subjects of the British Crown, rather than just calling them as Indians. Three important ideas were propagated in this Darbar. Number one, all of East India Company's territories and agreements with the Indian princely nations were to be upheld and continued and honored by the Crown. The former East India Company's territories were not to be extended anymore, and that there would be no encroachments on the British possessions in India, and the British will not intrude in the territories of others. So essentially, Britain was saying that we will retain the same policies and same respect of East India Company's model. At the same time, we will not expand any further. So essentially, in principle, the idea of colonization further in India was suspended. At the same time, native princes were given an assurance that their rights, their dignities, and their honor would be treated exactly and precisely as that of British Crown. Also, the Crown expressed a wish for British subjects to enjoy wealth and social growth, which can only be achieved via internal peace and good governance. Canning also said that the Crown and Canning are actually obligated to inhabitants of Indian areas in the same way that they are obligated to other subjects of the British Empire. Admission into government services and offices were to be henceforth done without any discriminations or without regard to the race or faith, and that except for those who were involved personally in criminal activities like murder of British subjects, everybody else who was involved in the 1857 revolt was given a general amnesty. Now, because of these core principles of governance which Canning was highlighting, This entire Act of Government of India 1858 is commonly referred to as the Magna Carta of India, and it was declared in L81 style to be in accordance with Queen's guiding policy of justice and religious tolerance. The Queen here we represent is Queen Victoria. Simultaneously, some important changes were done. The first important change was the Army of East India Company. Formerly, East India Company had a very big army. On the 1st of September 1858, the company conducted its last session. It was declared that East India Company's armies henceforth were not to exist in India, and that the soldiers of this army were now to be part of the newly created the British Indian Army. Indian sepoys were enlisted in British Army's regular service, so there was to be no discriminations. Queen Victoria's Government of India Act is sometimes also referred to as Act of Good Governance formally. It was passed in August 1858. It received its royal assent and became into force on the 1st of November 1858. The Act provided for the liquidation of East India Company and transferred all political powers, judicial and legislative powers of the company government to the British Crown. Simultaneously, the powers of East India Company's Board of Control and Court of Directors were now to be exercised by a newly created office in London known as the Secretary of State for India. This new office was created to exercise complete and comprehensive authority over Indian administration by the British Crown. The Secretary of State for India was also a member of the British Parliament, was responsible to the British Parliament, essentially introducing the principle of responsible legislature for the first time in India. At the same time, the Secretary was to be assisted by a member of 15 council. So 15 council members were to be selected. 50% of those had to have lived in India for a period of at least 10 years. At the same time, the British members of Parliament could always ask questions to the Secretary of State for India on the matters relating to Indian administration, and the Secretary was obliged to respond. So in technically speaking, the Governor General worked as a representative of the government and was responsible for the administration of the country as per the principles mentioned in Government of India Act 1858. The newly created office of Viceroy was created essentially to work as diplomat on parley with princely state. So it was essentially a ceremonial office, a point of contact between British Crown and the existing Indian princely states, and same person was to maintain the office of Viceroy as well as the Governor Generalship. And both these officers were made responsible to Secretary of State for India. Secretary of State for India was made responsible to the British Parliament. The Government of India in 1858 hence created a highly centralized structure of governance in India. Further, it was a formal change to be in reality. No major substantial changes really impacted the life of Indians when we observe the introduction of the Viceroy's office. Apart from the administrative structure, a new act was passed, Indian Councils Act 1861. It created a council to assess the Viceroy, very similar to the parliamentary system. Governor General's executive gained a 5th financial member as well as 6 to 12 members who would help the Governor General in formulating laws and legal mechanisms. For the convenience of the administration, the Governor General was given several new authorities and powers. For example, the legislation also gave Governor General the authority to allocate specific tasks to individual members of the Executive Council. In principle, the portfolio system. It is a system which is followed by India even today. Similarly, it also provided for the governments of Bombay and governments of Madras with legislative authority, that is, law-making authority. Previously, Bombay and Madras lost its authority in 1773 Regulating Act. Apart from the Indian Councils Act, Indian Civil Service Act 1861 was passed. This act clearly clarified that Indian or European could be appointed to any office listed in the Act's schedule if he had lived in India for a period of 7 years. The individuals had to pass a test in vernacular language of the district in which they were to work. However, the same ordinance also stated that certain upper jobs were only reserved for the covenant civil service. The covenant civil service essentially meant only British were eligible for these. It was only the non-covenanted civil service that Indians did get access to administration. Indians did oppose this provision. Indians were requesting admittance into the covenant civil service, which in time was satisfied much later after Canning's period. And then Indian High Court Act was also formed, where the Supreme Court of Calcutta, which was doing the jobs of Sadar Diwani Adalat and Sadar Faujdari Adalat, the Diwani Adalat being the civil court and Faujdari Adalat being the criminal court. New high courts were established in Calcutta, Madras and Bombay. The High Court took over the jurisdiction of Supreme Court, Sadar Diwani Adalat and Sadar Faujdari Adalat. The High Courts were to be constituted with one Chief Justice and a maximum of 15 justices. Justice qualifications were also clearly clarified in the Act, where at least 3 regular judges were to be there, including the Chief Justice had to be barristers. 1/3 of the judges had to be from the Covenant Civil Service. The High Court of Judicature of Fort Williams was actually formed on July 1st, 1862, which is what today we call the Calcutta High Court, with Sir Barnes Peacock as its first Chief Justice. Similarly, in the Calcutta High Court eventually also saw its first High Court Indian judge. Justice Shambhunath Pandit became the first Indian judge a year later in 1863. The Bombay High Court was created in 1862, August the 14th, and on the 26th of June 1862, the Madras High Court was also receiving its letters of patent, which is the letters of establishment. In addition to these letters of patent, in 1866, a High Court of Judicature for Northwest provinces was established in Agra. The seat was eventually moved from Agra to Allahabad in 1869, and by supplementary letters granted on the March of 11, 1990, this High Court came to be known as the High Court Judicature at Allahabad. In 2016, the Allahabad High Court observed its 150th anniversary. Apart from the High Court system, Indian Penal Code 1862 was also finally drafted and finally implemented during Canning's period. Lord Macaulay created the first draft of Indian Penal Code in 1830s. Eventually, by 1862, it was implemented. The final draft came to be known as Codes of Civil and Criminal Procedures. Prior to 1860, English criminal law formed the basis of justice in the presidency towns of Bombay, Madras and Calcutta. After independence, Pakistan acquired the Indian Penal Code, which eventually came to be called the Pakistan Penal Code. Bangladesh also had the similar code called Bangladesh Penal Code. Many other British possessions of South Asia, including Burma, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei, adopted exactly the same penal codes. Lord Canning is also known for introducing the IT reforms. If you recollect, I told you that a 5th financial member was introduced in Canning's Council in the Indian Councils Act. The first finance member was James Wilson. Wilson proposed 3 types of taxes. However, the second financial member of the Viceroy's Council was Laing. Laing only introduced income tax. The income tax proposal was introducing a 5% tax on incomes of rupees 500 or more in a year as a result of the Act. The government also cut its expenditure on military and civilian spending, and at the same time, to improve money, salt charge was raised, which is basically salt tax. And then during Canning's period, the Bengal Tenancy Act or the Bengal Rent Act 1859 was also introduced. This was the first tenancy regulation in Bengal. The law was introduced mainly to improve the landlord-tenant relationships in Bengal. Bengal had very strained relationships. The main goal of this regulation was to strengthen tenant-peasant position against landlords by clarifying the rights, having rights and limiting the landlord's ability to arbitrarily increase in rents and evictions. The farmers who had held the land for a period of 20 years on the same rent were believed to be entitled to be members of this act or implementable to this act under this act, and eventually this improved the landlord-tenant relationships in Bengal. It was also agreed that the rent could not be increased until a court inquiry was conducted in the region where the dispute is happening. It also gave Ryots the ability to rent their land, the idea of subleasing. Canning is known for introducing and making tea the most important aspect of British culture as well as Indian culture. Now, by 1860, tea from Assam, India, had begun to gain its traction and popularity in Europe. So, British government introduced a wasteland settlement policy in 1850 and 1860, mainly to make enormous expanses of land available in Assam for tea growing. Canning wanted to further encash on this because Assam tea had become too expensive and it was in high demand in United Kingdom. So Lord Canning further liberalized this entire wasteman's resettlement policy by introducing fee rules, where he allowed the potential planters to buy land for as little as 2 rupees 80 paisa to 5 rupees an acre without having to meet any of the clearance requirements as it was previously. Simultaneously, it resulted in a frantic expansion of tea plants in Assam, and this expansion of tea plantations in Assam is what we today call the tea mania. The tea mania was marked by the resale of tea gardens, as well as deceptions such as sale of lands with newly planted tea plants as protected or productive tea estates. Eventually, Assam tea gained popularity throughout Lord Canning's reign, and Assam tea became one of the most important teas in United Kingdom and also the rest of British Empire. Canning was commonly known for clemency. Now, when Lord Canning came to power, when he became the Viceroy, he had a severe challenge. He had to introduce a new administration. At the same time, he had to distance himself from the previous East India Company's rule. So at the time of the national movement, the essential 1857 revolt happened because Indians were quite unhappy about the British policy. So Lord Canning wanted to make sure that such a revolt or mutiny does not ever happen in India. So he favored Indian traders who aided British during the revolt. At the same time, he also ended the doctrine of lapse, which was the most painful event and the cause of 1857 revolt. He also was given the name Clemency Canning because he clearly mentioned that anybody who was not involved in criminal activity during the 1857 revolt would not be punished, and he gave a general amnesty to all those who participated in 1857 revolt. And that's the reason he was known as Clemency Canning, because of his gentle and tolerant attitude towards Indians. Lord Canning eventually departed India in March 1862, died in England a month later, and Lord Elgin became his successor. Now, Canning retired and left India in very poor health in March 1862 after being worn out by heavy and demanding tasks of restructuring the government after 1857 revolt. And prior to his retirement, he was elevated to the rank of earldom in 1859 in recognition for his services to the British India. Canning died on 17th of June 1862. Just as a few months after returning to England, he was buried in Westminster's Abbey. When we observe the Viceroys of India, Canning is the man who actually laid the foundation of Viceroy's rule in India. Canning created policies, Canning created those administrative models on which the subsequent Viceroys like Elgin started building. That's it in this video today, guys. Like, follow and subscribe. Do share this video to all the people you know, and let us meet in the next session. Thank you. Bye-bye. Faculty RK signing off.